My great-grandfather Ugolino fought for the Italians in World War II. He went to war, leaving his girlfriend at the time, Adelina, and his family. He came back to her once the wars ended. They got married in 1949 and lived in Abruzzo, Italy. My grandmother Rena, together with her family, took a leap of faith to set out to travel to Canada, with no money or any possessions. They did so in search for a better life for their family. They arrived in Canada in June of 1956 after a long trip through the Atlantic Ocean that lasted 14 days. At the time, Canada was open for immigration. Her father's youngest brother already lived in Niagara Falls. The rest of them moved to Welland and lived together in one small house. My grandmother, her two sisters, my great-grandfather, and my great-grandmother. They had trouble speaking English, which made it difficult for my great-grandparents to find jobs. They took whatever jobs were available at the time, like farming, shoemaking, cleaners, and construction work. They were paid minimum wage with no promotions. My grandmother and her sisters enrolled in school. After school, my grandmother became assistant for an optometrist. My great-grandparents Alfredo and Maria got married in 1934 and had a family of 9 children. From oldest to youngest, there was Elda, Dominic, Gina, Nino, who is my grandfather, born on October 23, 1945. After him was Celestina, Tullio, Alicia, Lucio, and Bruno Colangelo. When my grandfather was living in Italy, he lived a poor lifestyle. He went to school, then served 2 years in the military, and became a police officer right after. My great-grandparents stayed in Italy as their children moved to Canada. It all started with my uncle Dominic. He was the first to move. Then came Elda and Gina. After those 3, my great-grandfather came when he was 23 years old. My great-grandfather, like my others, also fought for the Italians in World War II. Back then, they didn't have a choice. Once he returned, he went back to his job as a farmer. My great-grandmother was also a farmer. My great-grandparents were married in 1947 and lived in Foggia. In 1967, they sold their house to move to Canada. They traveled by boat and arrived in Toronto. My great-grandmother's brother and his family already immigrated to Canada, so they were sponsored by them. My great-grandmother was a shoemaker, while my great-grandfather worked in construction. They didn't obtain a driver's license because of their language issue, so therefore they were relieved on transit systems. They eventually moved into their own home in Toronto. My grandmother did not pursue an education, as she and her 2 sisters looked for jobs in order to help put food on the table. My great-grandfather Luciano left his wife Filomena to also fight for the Italians in World War II. My great-grandparents got married in 1932. On September 13, 1950, my grandfather was born and had 2 older brothers. They lived in a small town called Foggia, a small region in Italy. Both my grandparents worked as farmers. In 1966, they sold their home and moved to Canada in search for a better life for their family. They traveled by plane and landed in Toronto. My great-grandmother's brother had already immigrated to Canada, so he sponsored my great-grandparents. They lived with him and his family until they were able to get their own home. Communication was very difficult because they did not understand the English language. They looked for whatever jobs were possible, like farming, shoemaking, and construction. My great-grandfather worked as a construction worker and worked long, hard hours while my great-grandmother was in a factory. My grandfather was 16 years old at the time and looked for employment in order to help provide for his family. Eventually, they were able to purchase a home in Scarborough. My grandparents met in 1968 and got married in 1969. They lived with my grandmother's parents until they were able to get their own home. My grandfather had various jobs, such as a shoemaker, factory worker, and even a groundskeeper. He eventually became a truck driver. My grandmother was a shoemaker until they decided to start a family. After long, hard hours, they were able to purchase their own home. First born was my Aunt Filomena. Then my mom was born on August 8, 1973, followed by my uncle Luciano. My mom grew up in Toronto, Ontario, and went to school at St. Aloysius until her family moved to Scarborough, where she went to school at St. Lawrence. Eventually, she moved to Markham, and my mom finished her elementary school at St. Matthews, and went to high school at St. Brother Andre. My mom studied legal assistant at Seneca College for 4 years. During her last year, she enrolled in a co-op program and got a job for Fish & Associates, where she currently works as a senior law clerk. My grandparents met in Scarborough at my grandfather's cousin's wedding. My grandmother was friends with one of my grandfather's cousins that were getting married that day. They were together for 11 months before they got married on July 12, 1969. On June 20th, 1971, after my grandparents were together for 2 years, my Aunt Sandra was born. 2 years later came my dad, Alfredo Colangelo, born on July 26, 1973. My dad started working when he was 17 years old. He became a construction worker with his father. When he was 19, he decided to pursue television broadcasting. He did a 3-year course at Seneca College and started volunteering at City TV Toronto. After 3 years of volunteering, he was offered a full-time job as a field camera operator. It's now been over 20 years since he's been working at City TV. He's been traveling the globe, places such as Hong Kong, Africa, Australia, London, and many more. In 2010, my father won a Gemini for the best news coverage, G20. My parents met when they were 15 years old. They dated for 10 years, starting in grade 10 at St. Brother Andre's Secondary School. On June 5th, 1999, they got married in Markham. 4 years later, they decided to start a family. On January 16, 2003, I was born.